Corrado again for Elasto Proxies vlog. And I'm here again with a good friend, Mr. Steve Melito. Steve, how's it going this morning?
Hey, it's going well, Rob. Great to be back.
Steve, we have to come up with a name for this vlog series, but I have no idea yet of what we're gonna call it, but we're gonna have to figure something out.
Well, maybe, just maybe, one of the people out there that are watching and listening will come up with an idea or ideas, and we'll have choices we can make.
If anyone out there has an idea of what we should call this, please don't be shy. The message below or send us an email, and we're more than happy to feature that in our future vlog series. But today we're talking about sound absorbers and sound absorber guide. So Steve, you wrote this blog for this week's series about sound absorption. So what is sound absorption? What's and why is it important?
So, there are different ways to control noise, which is unwanted sound. Let's get that right out in front. And sound absorbers, as the name implies, absorb rather than block or dampen. So, instead of blocking it altogether or reducing it in some way, the sound absorber, sort of like a sponge, absorbs it. In fact, the sound absorber is made of open cell acoustic foam, and it needs to be both at the source of the sound and the receiver. So, for example, if I'm sitting in the cab of a piece of mobile equipment, I'm going to want a sound absorber maybe in the engine bay and then a sound absorber in the cab. Now, there are other forms of acoustic insulation. We'll touch on some of those, but that gives you sort of a model of how it's not just I put it in one place and life is good. I've got to have it in a couple of different spots instead.
Absolutely. I think a good example, Steve, would be, in your bathroom, for example, if you just remove the carpet and a towel, like from your bathroom, all the ceramic that's there, and especially us Italians who think we put ceramic everywhere in the bathroom. But just to give an example, it's like it does that sound just bounces around from wall to wall because of again, the ceramic is not absorbing at all. It's actually reflecting or bouncing the sound off. So the absorb a towel or a carpet absorbs that sound. It's I would use that as a close example or analogy. Would that be fine?
Yes, that's a great example, Rob, and really gets at how sound travels in a wave. It's a form of energy and it bounces off things, and it can bounce off things in weird ways, as Elastoproxy has learned from conversations with customers over the years. The sound can come not just from the engine bay to the cab, but it might go through a side panel first, and that
Absolutely.
noise could drive the operator crazy.
So the absorber absorbs sound. What does it do with it after once it absorbs it, Steve?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting is it turns it into a small amount of heat, which I had no idea was the case. Not enough heat to keep us warm in the winter, unfortunately, but that's what happens to that sound. It's energy, so it gets converted to a different form of energy, although in a very low amount. Not enough to, cause a
No.
fire, God forbid, or anything like that, but that is what happens to it.
So let's look at you had mentioned before is that you're talking about blocking or dampening and sound absorber. So obviously the words kind of depict it, but let's go with that. What's the difference between the absorber and a sound blocker?
Yeah. So it might help to think about some use cases. So if we're in an office like we are now virtually, and there's a factory floor nearby, a lot of equipment running, we probably don't want to hear any of it in the office because we're on the phone or we're talking to
Correct.
colleagues and coworkers. So we'd want a sound blocker. Let's block that sound. Let's keep it coming in from the factory floor at all. I might want a sound absorber is, hey, I had a nice Mustang when I was a younger man, and I sure wanted to hear that engine. So I wouldn't want a sound blocker separating the driver's seat from the engine bay, but maybe a sound absorber to take off a little bit of the edge, but not all that much.
So the sound blocker would be, like you were saying, it could even be in like an enclosure. They would put like, and like you said, the receivers on the outside of that enclosure. So you would put the blocker on the inside so that the sound continuously bounces. So going back to the ceramic in the bathroom, you want that sound to kind of bounce within that enclosure and not escape out of
That's
that.
right. That's right.
And so going back to that, you have to understand where sound is coming from, what I guess what type of sound it is, high or low frequency, and where the receiver is versus where that sound is coming from.
That's right. Adds a whole additional dimension. So when you talk to Elastoproxy, usually one of the first questions that we'll ask is what's the source of the sound and what's the receiver? But then you also have to consider the frequency of the sound, because there's a difference, that high pitch that maybe comes from office equipment sometimes versus that low rumble of a diesel engine. And so you need to think about the frequency of the sound as well, because that gets into some of the materials of construction for the solution to the problem.
And going back to, and now I'm going to segue into the construction now. Can we construct a sound absorber and a sound blocker?
Yes, we can at Elastoproxy. We've got standard products and custom products, and examples of both when it comes to acoustic insulation are we make sandwiches, Rob, right? We're like a deli in a way.
Mm.
But you wouldn't want to eat these insulations
No,
because
no.
they wouldn't taste very good. But it's like when you go to, I don't know, Subway or whatever, you tell them what you want, right? So I want a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So we can build you an insulation sandwich like that based on your requirements. So it could include both a sound absorber and a sound blocker. Maybe it just says a sound absorber. Maybe it's got other features to it. Maybe includes thermal insulation as well. So it's a complete thermal acoustic solution.
And I think we also have to include. I think going back, I know we've hit this again 2 weeks in a row. We're gonna bring it up again. MTAP again. We're gonna have to bring this up because the facing of the sound absorption or sound absorber is very important as well, right? Depending on where it's going.
That's right. So I can have a sound absorber with, say, a vinyl facing. Why would I want vinyl? It's not because I'm nostalgic about those old Elvis records, but it's because vinyl can be wiped clean. So if it's inside of a cab and the guy's got coffee, goes over a bump, it hits the headliner, it's nice to know you can wipe that down.
Exactly.
That might not be the case for something where it's going to be in the engine bay and there's heat coming off of the engine. Then the facing material might be an aluminum foil instead.
Or is it close to oil or gases? Or so it's very important again that MTAP, super important that we continue asking those questions.
Yep,
So
media, application, temperature, pressure. Just to
there
work
you
that in.
go. Steve, I'm gonna put the link below because you did a phenomenal job of writing Acoustic Insulation 101, which here's the link below, which goes into a bit of those types of details that we were just talking about now. And for those that read that and says, "Oh, I need a bit more. I need a bit more detail." Guess what? There's a 201 as well. So that's the next level, and that next level talks about sound power, which is impressive. So, as someone that deals with the customers that ask this, hey, I want to reduce my sound by 10 decibel points. Like I have to get under by 10 decibel points. I don't think a lot of people understand how sound power works in terms of how much percentage it actually is to reduce that sound.
It is complicated. So to dial back a little bit, so the way that the human ear detects sound in our ears is by detecting the pressure changes caused by sound waves because of how sound travels. And so the amplitude of the variation, sort of the stack of the waves, so to speak, that's measured in decibels, dB. I think most people are familiar with that, but what they're
Yep.
not familiar with is sound pressure level, which is a sound power measurement. And sound pressure level, it uses a logarithmic scale, and the reference is the threshold of hearing. Does it sound mathematical? It is, very much so. But for the end user, what really matters is that doubling the noise reduction may not cut the sound power in half. So it's not always about if I add twice as much, I'm going to get twice the results. There's some mathematics involved. There's some testing involved with the different acoustical materials, and Elastoproxy can help you to figure out how much that insulation sandwich can actually absorb, dampen, or block, depending on what you need.
I'm going to see if I can bring that up, Steve, in terms of that chart is what impressed me
Yeah.
the most. So let me see if I can bring that up. There we go. Let's see if this is going to work. There we go. We see that. So look at that. 1 decibel reduced by 1 decibel is 21% sound power reduction. So the ones that want 10, and that's usually the request we get. They love the round numbers, right? Which is normal.
Sure.
I would like to reduce it by 10 decibel. And they're not choosing 10 just by, like, again, they have some requirements. They have to maintain either city level noise levels or internal for the cab operator. But sound absorbers can only do so much.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at that, already at 3 decibels, you're reducing your sound power by 50%. And that's a huge ask already at that point. So it's very important to understand when asking, okay, I want to reduce it by 10, you're looking at 90% sound power reduction. So it's a massive ask, and that is much more than just the material being used to absorb or block sound. Now you're looking at potential structure of the vehicle or whatever you're trying to block versus just a material that's going to be surrounded there. So I thought that this was important to put on there so that everyone understands. But again, you can see the link at the bottom. Acoustic Insulation 201. Please go read that, because that is an incredible blog that Mr.
Mm-hmm.
Melito here has written for us.
Thanks, Rob. Hey, but because you talk to customers all the time, would you recommend to them, as we do with seals, to think about acoustic insulation sooner in the process than at the
Absolutely.
very end?
We had an example of that a customer had built. It's can't go into to details, but they had built this big vehicle that had to go to Europe, and once they built it, the customer loved it, but then they had an issue with the sound level that was being emitted from it. Now you're talking about everything is built, right? Like your structure's built, like your molds are all done, everything is. So now you have X amount of gaps that now you can squeeze in certain sound absorbers or blockers at that point. So we had to they came to us because they're like, everything's kind of built. They were able to make certain modification on the build. So what we were able to do is advise them that they had like an open chassis for where their engine is, so that the engine can breathe. But however, that obviously sound escapes from that and gets into the operator cab. So we see if we can find ways to blocking that or closing that as much as possible. We put sound blockers in that in that enclosure versus the open enclosure that it once was. We were able to look at vibration as well, because that was another point that was that's huge again in terms of sound, because the engine vibrates and the sound comes into the cab. So it wasn't just a matter of an absorber, a sheet of acoustic foam, but it was multiple products that we had to look at, as well as a structure change to bring that down. We were able to go. They were at if I'm not mistaken, I think they were hitting 84, 85 decibels. We had to bring it down to 73. And we were actually able, with the modifications that we were able to do, and we worked in conjunction with the partner, we were actually bringing it down to close to 70. So it was a huge success on that. But again, it was after the product was built versus beforehand, So there was some let's say MacGyvering in terms of what we had to do.
It's a lot easier than trying to re-engineer it. And as you said, all those tools were built. They don't want to have to scrap them, and it gets expensive.
It gets very expensive. But again, the customer was very open-minded, which is huge. And that's the most important thing, that the customer was open-minded to say, hey, like, what maybe there's some things we can change or not change. So that's the fun part, that when we're able to work with customers that are flexible on that side.
For sure. It's all part of the complete solution that Elastoproxy can provide, right? It's not just the door seals or the window seals, but it's also the acoustic insulation.
Exactly. Steve, thank you again. I'm going to put up the link here for the sound absorber, guys. You can see below, everyone. So please, Steve, thank you again for joining us and making it fun.
You bet, Rob. It was fun. Let's do this again sometime soon.
I guess next week.
Okay, sounds good.
To everyone out there, thank you again for joining us on behalf of Elasto Proxy. My name is Roberto Nacarado. My good friend Steve Melito joining us here again today, and see you guys soon. Have a good one.